Thank you. Can probably get started. So
Okay.
tonight we've got Mr. Pete Shrake here, one of the intrepid archivists at the Circus World Museum, State Historical Society, and as part of our season theme of looking back at Wisconsin's history keepers, he's going to talk about one of his predecessors at the Historical Society archives, Milo Quaife, who has a pretty unique story. So the first speaker who came to us was talking about kind of a guy who preserved history based on his personal curiosity into all different aspects of the past. Last week we heard about the work of the Ho-Chunk Nation in preserving their oral tradition and their culture through some difficult times. So we're looking forward to a talk on Milo Quaife.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, I'm going to start with probably an apology for the title. Milo Quaife, the greatest historian in his field. And part of that is, grandiose hyperbole. I mean, I am, after all, the archivist of Circus World Museum, and everything is the most splendiferous, outstanding, and most amazing thing you've ever seen in your life. And I was struggling with the title, and really was. And so I was like, what, Milo Quaife, what? And I actually then found one of his obituaries from 1959, and they literally called him the greatest historian in his field. So perfect, it meshed right together, hence Milo Quaife, the greatest historian of his field. Was he really? There's a lot of great historians. Today, yesterday, going all the way back to Herodotus, one of the first great Greek historians. There's been a lot of great historians. Was he the greatest? That's your personal opinion. Was he a great historian? Yes. Was he an important historian? Yes. And so today we're going to kind of go into that a little bit and talk about who he was, but really his background, his career, and we're going to talk about his connections to this site because there was a time where he was really very interested in Juliet Kinsey and her writing of Wabun. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that. I will say, though, it was a bit of a challenge for me. Of the different presentations I've given over the years, I've not really focused on the history of a historian. And historians, the more you get to know us, we talk about events, we talk about other people. Nobody talks about us, and honestly, I think most historians, I think Quaife would even agree, we're not that interesting a group of people. But at the same time, we are the people who are presenting and recording these events that we're so fascinated with. And it's important to look at historians because, like I say, they frame our thinking. And I believe you're talking about Frederick Jackson Turner next week. Turner is one of those examples where you want to learn about Turner because of his frontier thesis, because of the fact that for generations, this was a historian that influenced how historians thought, and then consequently, whether you read something by Turner or Quaife, their writings influence how we think of history. So they're worthy to get to know. So a little bit of a background, and I was having this, there we go. Born in 1880 in Nashua, Iowa, which is, to me, kind of interesting because actually for all of his career, he doesn't really focus on Iowa history at all. His background and what he's known for is Chicago and the history of the Old Northwest. Gets his master's from the University of Missouri, his PhD from the University of Chicago. Quaife is a part of a new generation that is emerging in the historical field. During this time period, the historical profession is starting to change and evolve. Historians in the mid-19th century and earlier really take their cues from literary writers. And you look at some of the classic historians of the time like Bancroft. It's not what I would call a professional approach to history, a methodical approach of history, an analysis of the art of the evidence of the documents and the oral histories and such. But by the time you have around the turn of the century, you have the evolution and the sophistication of our university system, and the history departments are changing at that time. You have the influence of kind of the old school German masters of the university system bringing their philosophical approach to the methodical study of history. That's kind of coming into the United States. That's where Quaife is coming from. And he's part of this new generation of really, I would say, outgoing, energetic historians that are examining the past not through almost disdaining, it would almost say, oral history, but looking at documents and the analysis of documents and the critical analysis of the past. That's Milo Quaife, to a T, because and he's really, at the time he completes his PhD, he's already being recognized as a historian of some ability. His PhD dissertation, which I'm going to forget at the moment, but I believe was on the slavery in the Old Northwest, gets its attention of other notable historians, including one, Andrew McLaughlin, who was a major constitutional historian for that era, and recommends that this new young PhD graduate serve as the editor of a major project to publish the collected diaries of President James Polk. And Quaife takes on this role and produces a 4-volume diary, or a collection of volumes on the diaries of James, edited on the diaries of President James Polk. So I mean, right away, taking on and essentially being recognized for his abilities, and being assigned significant tasks. Right away, he gets a professorship at the Lewis Institute of Technology in Chicago, and I believe today it is the Institute of Technology in Chicago. They just simply dropped the Lewis, and within a few years rises to a full professor. It's in this time that he is the editor of those 4-volume diaries of James Polk. Those diaries get him the attention of the Chicago Historical Society. They are the publishers of those diaries, and it's in that next step that kind of takes Quaife more into his direction. There's 2 things that happen in this time period that really kind of take him into the direction, I think, that really he leads for much of the rest of the career. He's hired by the Chicago Historical Society at this time to be a lead consultant. They are a few years out of celebrating the Chicago Massacre, or essentially kind of the birth of Chicago. The kind of classic myth, or not myth, but popular conception at the time was Chicago really gets its birth as a community with the great disaster that happened during the War of 1812 to the Chicago garrison. And so they're celebrating its centennial, and a few years before that, leading up to it with the preparations, they hire Quaife as a consultant, as a historical consultant. Well, that brings Quaife into the direct contact with this great event, the Great Chicago Massacre, where the garrison at Fort Dearborn closes upon the order of General Hull in Detroit, and the garrison is marching out of Fort Dearborn, and they're attacked by the Potawatomi, and a wholesale slaughter ensues. And one of the lead accounts of this great disaster is Juliet Kinsey's account, which is a big section of her book, Waban. And Quaife, as a result of this work for the Chicago Historical Society, writes in 1910 a very critical analysis of Juliet Kinsey's account of the Chicago Massacre, and it's published in the Mississippi Valley Historical Review. And it's not particular. He doesn't have a high view of it. And actually, it's not that he's kind of personally attacking Juliet Kinsey, but he's taking apart her account of the Chicago disaster and literally questioning every point that she makes and comparing it next to actual documented historical accounts, and looking at, could certain events actually take place, and kind of comes up to this idea that much of that account is simply not accurate. It's the first real critical analysis of this account, which by that point, which had been in publication in one form or another, Kinsey's account had been published in one form or another since 1844 and had been taken as gospel. And it was a revelatory kind of like, oh my goodness, this guy is criticizing one of the classic stories of Chicago history. I'm getting ahead of myself. We're going to come more back to that and why that was both, it isn't as bad as it sounds. Quaife's criticism of Juliet Kinsey is not as horrible as it sounds, but we'll get back to that later on in the presentation. But that happens early on in his career. So not long after PhD completion, all these things happen. He's an emerging, rising figure in the history, the professional history, and early on he encounters Juliet Kinsey and really starts to examine her work. Also, what is occurring which has a real impact for any of us who are really studying this era, is a legal court case that is brewing along the Des Plaines River down by Chicago. There is the Economy Light and Power Company out of Joliet wants to put up a dam across the Des Plaines River. And it's to create essentially hydroelectric power and a big power plant there. Well, the local governments, City of Chicago, the other local towns along the area, local leading business leaders, really don't like this idea. You're blocking what is a crucial navigational route between Lake Michigan and inner waterways and say even the Illinois River and linking to the Mississippi River. You know, it's going to disrupt economic life in Chicago. This dam is going to disrupt economic life in Chicago. And it becomes a great big legal battle. And Quaife is hired not by the Economic Light and Power Company, by the power company, but by the opponents of the power company to do an intensive deep dive research into the economic development of the era, the navigation and transportational history of Chicago and the Great Lakes, eventually produces like 500 pages of notes. And ultimately, and actually is brought to testify in this legal court case. And his testimony takes days to complete. And he proves pretty conclusively that you know, navigation along the Des Plaines River and the Illinois River, you know, is a crucial link between the Great Lakes and the Mississippi River. It doesn't go anywhere. I mean, the power company wins their case and they build the dam, which I believe is still there today. But it's interesting for me for two reasons. One is that it's, to me, an earlier example, and I may be off base here about how early of an example this is, but it's an early example of a historian serving as a witness in a legal case. Now, when I was doing my master's thesis up in Eau Claire, I was writing about the Menominee Indian Treaty of 1831. And that was a case that was currently being put to the test in various court cases around Green Bay due to off-reservation hunting and fishing rights. And one of my cooperating professors was a legal witness and served on one of the sides of this court case. So historians being involved in a legal argument in a court setting as a witness, to me, is a fascinating element of our profession. Well, Quaife is, I think, an early example of that. Maybe not the earliest, but an early example of a historian plying his trade for something besides the interpretation of history, but for a court case. Now I'm digressing, but you have to forgive me. These notes, this work that he does, is also what's really important because it results ultimately in the publication of this book, Chicago in the Northwest. Which is still today, has been reprinted a number of times, is still, and it covers the history from 1763 to 1835, is still one of the go-to histories for early frontier Old Northwest and Chicago history. And it really is born out of these notes and the research that Quaife does for this court case. Very important book and a very interesting, I think, facet of his early career. Talking about the book, though, gives us a good segue because this not necessarily the start of his career as a writer, but is an early example of one of the many writings that this guy does. Quaife is a prolific writer in both large and small circumstances. This is a guy that had to literally be, when he wasn't doing his various duties at the Wisconsin Historical Society or the Detroit Public Library, this is a guy that had to always be researching and always writing, because the guy always is cranking out stuff really throughout his entire life. And so we have, of course, Chicago in the Northwest. One of his first books is Chicago's Highways, Old and New. Not long after this court case in 1916, he's savvy enough that he develops a business relationship with the R.R. Donnelley Publishing Company, major publishing company, which becomes the major publishing house for almost all of his publications. And with his relationship with R.R. Donnelley, he creates a series of books called the Lakeside Classics, which is a systematic reprinting of classic tales and earlier publications of different points of Northwestern and Western history. And Quaife is kind of the editor of this. He's writing editorial comments to these historical texts. And so this business relationship actually carries through almost to the rest of it. I think it is to the rest of his life. Big thing. But from this point onward, from 1910 onward, I mean, he's writing book after book after book. He's writing book reviews. So he's reviewing other historians' works. He's writing both scholarly and I would say both articles for both scholarly publications, really serious publications, like that one critiquing Kinsey's account of the Fort Dearborn Massacre, but then also for such heavy scholarly journals like the Mississippi Valley Historical Review, he's also writing articles for local newspapers. And everything in between. So he's cranking out articles, large and small, book reviews. He's editing compilations of documents, like this volume here, The Conquest of Illinois. This is another book that I have that is the capture of Old Vincennes, which is an account of George Rogers Clark and other accounts of this Revolutionary War campaign that happened in Illinois. So he's compiling documents, editing them, publishing them. Again, cranking out more and more and more books. During his career, he ends up editing two very distinguished historical journals, which we'll talk about later, just mention later on as well. So again, just to imply this alone, I mean, the activity that all of this implies, and for someone who's dabbled in writing, I mean, writing is a painful exercise for me, I will be first to admit. Despite some of the stuff that I've put out, and hopefully people won't say is good or bad, I don't know. But obviously he had to enjoy it, you know, and obviously there was something within him that he could propel out and push out this kind of work. I think that says something not only about his intellect, but about who he was, that he was always researching, always writing. So what kind of generalizations can we make about Quaife during really this period, but also throughout his entire career? Like I mentioned before, he is a part of this new generation of professionally trained historians, critically examining the historical evidence, the diaries, the letters, the documents, the interviews, and really sifting them and weighing them together and coming at what he hopes to be as the objective truth. Now, this is something that in graduate school, in historiography, we're really forced to, you know, what is the objective truth of history? And is there such a thing as objective truth in history? And it was drilled in my brain that, you know, no, you silly student, it's not. You know, there is no such thing as objective truth because we all have our interpretations that we make on the past. I think there's some truth to that. I think in this time period, that was still the dominant idea, is that you could get to an objective truth of the matter, you know, through a almost dispassionate approach to surveying and examining the historical evidence. That's Quaife during this time period. So he believed in a careful examination of resources. He promoted local and regional history. That really is borne out in his writings, especially his journal articles and his newspaper articles. And when you look at the titles, I mean, even here, Chicago Highways Old and New, Chicago in the Northwest, The Conquest of Illinois, Chicago. These are all Chicago area related publications. And a lot of his journals are focusing in his career, focus on this area. So he walked the walk and he talked the talk. He believed in local and regional history. But also when you think about what I was talking about with he's writing not just scholarly journals, but journals for newspapers and other and lesser scholarly publications, he believed that you should and could bridge the gap between scholarly history and writing for mass general audiences. And that you could write good, solid history for the general audience, so that, you know, the non-super professional historian can find a good, solid history book that is entertaining, you know, that is good to read, but is also solid and correct in its facts. He did believe that that was possible. And so he was, even though he was, I get this image of a very precise individual, you know, and a very exacting individual, and who will probably cut you to the bone with examining your historical, you know, interpretation of the past. That's my imagining. But he's also encouraging and engaging, you know, and he wants to produce materials that anybody can read. That says something, I think, about the man. And so all this you kind of glean, I think, from the types of writings in his writing career. So that takes us up, though, really, well, that covers most of his career, but really up to a point, he's still a professor at the technical college. In 1914, he becomes the superintendent of the Wisconsin Historical Society. he's a very young superintendent at this point. He follows Reuben Gold Thwaites, and Thwaites, who dies unexpectedly in 1914. There is a search for a new superintendent. Today, it's the director of the Wisconsin Historical Society, or I should say, at the time, it is the superintendent of the State Historical Society of Wisconsin. I still prefer that title for that agency, but I also work for it, so it is the Wisconsin Historical Society. There was a number of different potential candidates, but Quaife at this point had emerged as really an important historian, a young, dynamic, important historian out of Chicago, Midwestern. And so he gets the attention of the Board of Curators, who hire him as the new superintendent for the State Historical Society. He is only the third superintendent at this point. He follows Reuben Gold Thwaites, who himself had followed Lyman Draper, who was the founding director of the State Historical Society, the guy who creates these voluminous Wisconsin historical collections and is himself a great collector of documents and oral histories that Thwaites himself continued. So he's following in the footsteps of two big personalities. And that ultimately proves to be a big challenge for him, and one that he ultimately kind of stumbles and doesn't quite overcome during this period. Thwaites was himself had been a long-time director of the agency. Thwaites was very popular, both outside the agency and internally amongst the agency staff, especially amongst the leaders of the agency. And we have three here, these three ladies who themselves referred to themselves as the Big Three of the Wisconsin Historical Society: Annie Nuns, Mary Foster, and Iva Welsh. Mary Foster was had the nickname of Mary Queen of the Stacks, which that in itself, I think, implies, this formidable gal who, don't mess with the books in the stacks. Iva Welsh was the chief cataloger, so her focus was all of the cataloging activities, which is again a very formidable and exacting task. Annie Nuns was the de facto number 2 of the State Historical Society. She was the assistant superintendent in everything but name. And so these were the three main figures. And Quaife early on, even though he certainly tried to reach out to them, they were really loyal to Thwaites, and they didn't, I think, they didn't click. And so from almost the very beginning, even though Quaife formally appointed Nuns as the assistant superintendent for the agency, this is, 1914. You think of the position of women in 1914. To have Quaife appoint Nuns to such a significant and important position, I think also says something about the man. However, not just these three gals, but other old-time, long-time employees of the agency, I think Quaife was someone new. And I think we've all seen or heard of people within different organizations that sometimes new leadership doesn't click with the old leadership. And I think this is what happened to Quaife. Quaife also, unfortunately, when you think about the dates, he's coming into the superintendency on the eve of World War I. And World War I proves to be a huge challenge for the Wisconsin Historical Society. A lot of their staff go off to fight for the war or become involved in other efforts of the war effort, whether it's factory work or war relief work or serving in the armed forces. So the staff literally are gutted. And then the supply, the paper necessary for printing and the adhesive used for literally like the labels for stuff are becoming short of supply. So the war years are very difficult, lean years for the Wisconsin Historical Society, and Quaife has to kind of shepherd all of that and work through all of that. But he is able to achieve some interesting things. He still collects materials for the archives and for the library, and he does over time prove to be a very effective collector of historical material, both here and then after he leaves the Wisconsin Historical Society. His biggest legacy, though, is the creation in 1917 of the Wisconsin Magazine of History. And anybody who studies Wisconsin history knows the impact of this publication, which is still with us today. He's the one that creates it. He's the first editor of it until 1922. All of that, though, doesn't really help him with the various internal turmoil that is affecting the agency during this time period. And the Board of Curators and Quaife, the difficulty of it ultimately culminate in a mutual agreement by Quaife to basically step down from the superintendency. He's demoted, effectively. He remains at the organization, but he is now just the editor of the Wisconsin Historical Society. He holds that position for a few years. before he leaves ultimately in 1922. So it's not a long tenure, and it's a rocky tenure. But it's a tenure that, again, think of the time and the era and the challenges that are facing that organization. But then also it's an era which he ultimately leaves one of the things that I consider to be one of his greatest legacies, and that is the Wisconsin Magazine of History. So he's out of work for a few years, and he continues to write. He still has his business relationship with R.R. Donnelley carrying him through, and he's cranking out different volumes. But in 1924, he's asked he's asked by the Detroit Public Library to work for the Burton Historical Collection. Now that's another major collection, like if you're familiar with the stuff that's in Madison at the Wisconsin Historical Society and the stuff that's at the Chicago Historical Society, these are main repositories of historical materials for the era that many of us study, the era that's covered, or that this house touches upon, that early frontier, that early 19th century history of the Old Northwest and the Western Great Lakes. The Burton Historical Collection is another one of those significant collections of material from this era, and he is now the secretary and editor of that department within the Detroit Public Library. The collection starts off as a private collection of rare books and manuscripts of a local attorney by the name of Burton, who donates his vast collection of materials to the Detroit Public Library. So that's the collection that Quaife is now the chief of. And under his stewardship, until he retires over 20 years, he stays there over 20 years, he really grows it. And it's under his leadership that the collection just blossoms. And more and more materials are acquired for this important collection. So this and his time period at the Wisconsin Historical Society really show his skills at identifying key historical resources and putting them together in a public repository. During this time period as well, in 1924, the same year that he works, that he starts at the Detroit Public Library, he takes on the editorship of the Mississippi Valley Historical Review. It's not a publication that you hear about today. It's still published, and he's not the first editor, but it's a fairly new publication at this point. The Mississippi Valley Historical Review had been around for a number of years. And actually, Quaife, when he publishes his critique of Julia Kinsey, he publishes it in the Proceedings of the Mississippi Valley Historical Review. Well, now that organization has moved on to publishing a scholarly historical journal. And Quaife is now the editor of it. This journal is still around today. It is now the Journal of American History. And it is, I believe, put out by the Organization of American Historians, and both then as in now are very prestigious, is a very prestigious organization. And if you are a serious historian and if you're published by the Journal of American History, that's a huge deal. And no less so than, I think, in the 1920s and 30s when Quaife was involved. So again, that's the mark of his skill as an editor. This carries him really through the rest of his career. Like I say, he's only really in charge of the review for, was it about 6 years, but he remains at Detroit until he retires in 1947. But afterwards he continues to write and continues his work as a historian. But that kind of brings us up, I think, to something that, so we've been talking about the life of Quaife. We should spend some time talking about what I think was one of his favorite subjects, and that was Juliet Kinsey. Because not only did he focus on her for his 1910 paper, he continued to remain intrigued by this lady who lived here at Portage and was also this key figure in Chicago. And think of all the other writings that we've talked about. He's always writing and examining and looking at the history of Chicago. Early on in this essay in 1910, he, at least on the surface, appears to be highly critical of Julia Kinsey, and these quotes come from that. Mrs. Kinsey had but the vaguest comprehension of the historian's calling, or quote, to the objective detachment of the historian, she is a complete stranger. I mean, that's kind of it's a very polite, gentlemanly, but yet distinct slam, against Julia Kinsey. Quaife strived for one of the things that really bugged him at the time, and I've heard other historians even today really express this as an issue. They were trying to root out myths, what they perceived as myths. or commonly held popular conceptions in history. And do these myths or popularly held conceptions hold up against the weight of historical evidence? And when they don't, it's your duty as a historian to call them out, not to be personally attacking and critical, but to point them out. And that's what he does ultimately in his 1910 paper, is to really critically examine Kinsey's account of the Chicago Massacre during the War of 1812. And when you read that paper, it is evident. There are problems with that account. But again, I want to say there are strict caveats to that. The Quaife also considers, at least in 1910, that Kinsey is really more of a romantic writer, which is maybe true, but it's also not fair, in that most of the writers of that era were, you could say by our today's standards, romantic writers. I mean, it was just the style in which anybody wrote. Quaife makes the valid point that Kinsey's account of the Fort Dearborn Massacre was strictly a Kinsey family account of this massacre, and doesn't take into account that John Kinsey Sr. had his own motives going on in Chicago, that John Kinsey Sr., John Harris Kinsey's father, had a long-standing dispute with the fort captain, Captain Held, and that dispute had a role to play in what happened in this disaster. And it's also not Kinsey's reminiscences of the war, of that event, but rather her telling of the family recollections, and first published in 1844 anonymously, but then later on, first appearing then later in Waubun. I mean, you're talking about family recollections of an event from 15 years or more before. And obviously, as we all think of our own family history, our family history is, we're going to protect it, whether you're consciously realizing it or not. When you're telling stories about our family, you're going to be more positive about it. And that's really what Kinsey is. She's telling the oral history of the Kinsey family and the Kinsey's perspective of this event. Kinsey herself admits that. I mean, she openly says, this is the story being told to me by my mother-in-law. And Quaife does point that out. But what is the interesting thing, but that, again, that's why Quaife has kind of such at least initially, a problem with her, is that the Kinsey narrative from the War of 1812 was a big thing in Chicago. It was kind of taken as gospel as to what happened with this event. And so he felt he was performing his duty. But in the same time, both in 1918 and then later in 1932, he's not harsh about every aspect of Waubun. And he does write, yet she succeeds well in creating a lifelike picture of the current scene of her daily activities and experiences. That, to me, says a lot as well, because I've used Waubun myself, not just for the John Kinsey book, but for other projects that I've done. And I'm not the only historian to have done that. I'm going to come back to that, actually, that statement in a minute. But I guess we can talk about it now. I mean, it's this recognition of the fact that there's more to the story of Kinsey's writings. And let's look at that. All of his criticisms, all of Quaife's criticisms of Julia Kinsey are about one section of the book, the Chicago Massacre element. And if any of you read Waubun, and I felt this when I first read it, and I still do when I read it now, it's that you're booming along, you're talking about her life in Wisconsin, coming to Wisconsin, she's here. Then all of a sudden you're reading about the Chicago Massacre. It's this section that's like, which one of these things is not like the other, which one of these things don't belong. The Chicago story doesn't really fit with the rest of the narrative of the book. And that is really the one section, when you look at everything that Quaife has written, when he's critiquing her about the story of the Fort Dearborn Massacre. He writes this about the rest of the work of Waubun, which I think he's spot on. She creates a lifelike picture of the current scene of her daily activities and experiences. And Waubun is a rich document, rich narrative, well-written narrative about her daily life in Wisconsin. And which is why I think it is a classic of Wisconsin history. And like I say, I'm not the only one. Nancy Durkin Keating, who wrote the biography of Julia Kinsey, essentially says so as well. I think that's why I say you got to take Quaife in context of what he's actually critiquing, and the fact that he too, though, he doesn't ever really leave Kinsey after he talks about her in this 1910 paper. he keeps coming back to her, and he keeps ferreting out other writings that she did. And Juliet had 2 other books that she wrote, Walter Ogilvy, or Ogilvy, I think that's, I can never pronounce that right, and Mark Logan, The Life of the Bourgeois. And he reads them, and he finds them, you know, in this year around the World War I in the 1920s, and when they're long out of print. And there were hard books to come by, hard copies to come by. He seeks them out, finds them, and reads them, and so he keeps his interest. There's something about Julia Kinsey that intrigues him, and that is probably what other historians looking at this dynamic come to the conclusion is that he has problems with her Chicago account, but there's other aspects of her narrative that still ring true. And so is she just a romantic writer, or is she really a commentator of her time? And I think in the end, he discovers that she's both, because in 1932, when he's doing yet another edition of his Lakeside Classics, his many-volume series that he puts out with R.R. Donnelly, he reprints Wabun. It's worthy of reprint in his mind, and he writes the foreword to it, and he's very complimentary of Julia Kinsey and of the writing that she does. So he's not, again, supremely critical of Julia Kinsey. And I think that again, that's interesting, is that as a historian too, he can be critical, but he can also be generous at the same time. And obviously, you know, everything's not all black and white. And to a good historian, there's no aspect of history that is truly black and white, truly all one thing and truly all the other. Maybe with the exception of the Nazis in World War II. I mean, they were just bad, right? But but so many different aspects of history are much more complicated than this person's right and this person's wrong. There's subtle stuff going on. And that's, I think, what we see here with Milo Quaife. So that's Milo Quaife. He does stay with us for a number of years, even though he retires in 1947, continues to write, continues to publish, but it all comes very quickly to an end in 1959. He's traveling up in the vicinity of Sault Ste. Marie. According to the obituary, they don't really say what they're doing up there, except for the fact that he is, I think I almost quote, pursuing activities related to his lifelong work. Which probably means he's working on some sort of new historical research project, when he gets into a car accident and he is killed instantly. So he's killed at the age of 80 in this auto accident. And with him, his writings end, obviously his life and his career end. But he is still this interesting figure. And in the end, when you look at someone like Milo Quaife, you know, like, again, I've used his materials. Other historians have used his materials. He's produced volumes of works like these 4 here that maybe on the surface are not terribly exciting. That is a 4-volume set of a documentary analysis and collection of the study of the creation of the Wisconsin Constitution. I've had those volumes for maybe 20 years. Have I read them? No. Am I going to? I don't think so. You know, but he put those together. That's an example of it's with commentary, the selection of the documents. You know, that says, again, these little things that you can glean about a person. But in the end, you know, he is a historian who, like, he dies in 59. The bulk of his work is really pre-World War II. And there are not many historians who, you know, not the creator of history, not someone like Kinsey. She experienced history and she's writing her memoirs. But Quaife is different. He is a historian examining the past and writing about it. There's not many historians, I think, that can say that they've been dead now for 60 plus years and their work is still valid. Their work can still be critically accepted by and used by historians today. And in the end, I think that's the highest compliment you can give any historian. And I think Quaife himself would consider that a high compliment, that his works are still being read, used, and are considered relevant by not just historians, but by the general audience today. And that's Milo Quaife. Thank you very much. And if there's any questions, I'm happy to answer them. Okay. All right.
Good overview.
Thank you. Thank you.
Presentation.
Yeah.
Interesting figure who made a big impact on, you know, not only still has valid opinions on historical topics, but having actually just preserved all that material.
Indeed. Indeed. I mean,
thanks for that. And we have one more. We can talk over the cicada. We have one more presentation on actually this Thursday, the 29th, again, Frederick Jackson Turner, our last Wisconsin's history keepers that we're touching in this series. Don't forget about our other events coming up on August 30th. We're having a nature walk with, July 30th. Nature walk by Tony Abate, who's a naturalist who has some pretty interesting perspectives on the natural resources of this property. Then going into August, make sure you don't miss our August 14th and 15th Enduring Skills events. In this theme of remembering how history is passed down through time and preserved, that also includes historical skills. So during that event, you get a chance to try firsthand, a vast, huge variety of different skills that have either been passed down through time or just rediscovered through historical research. So don't forget that. So overall, thank you guys for.
One question I was going to ask is, was he criticized? Were there critics of his book, like, this is wrong, I researched this, stuff like that?
Not that I found, not to say that there isn't, and there probably were some. I mean, I think every author gets that. Generally speaking, no. I mean, I think his work then, as is now, was highly regarded. I mean, to some extent, his work today is a little bit dated. One of the accounts that I've read when you look at him is that one of the things Quaife didn't do is he really didn't do a lot of personal narratives or look at the personalities behind the stories that he was researching. He was the kind of historian that looked at government figures and government stories and, looking at soldiers and the regiments and in a way the skeleton of history, I guess. But it's and that today it's very important, but there's the whole social history that is kind of the meat between all of that that he didn't go into. But that's also, when you think of his criticism of Kinsey, he's criticizing her for essentially being a romantic literary writer. She's a product of her time, right? And so Quaife is a product of his time. That is the kind of history that professional historians were turning out. And it's really only since, say, like the 1960s that you get yet another shift in the evolution of historical thought and study. So he's a little bit dated in that regard. He can get some criticism for that. The Kinsey family wasn't also very happy with him, and they took his criticism of Juliet's writing not in the kind of professional sense that he was meaning it. He was not attacking her personally, but they took it, I think, personally, especially Juliet's daughter, Nellie Kinsey, or is it Gordon, who is from the one that lives in Savannah. Not long after his 1910 paper comes out, she puts out her own edition of Waubun, one of the many that are out there, and really actively works to continue the legacy of her mother, and it's in direct relation to Milo Quaife's work. And so I would say the Kinsey family probably worked very critical of Milo Quaife. So there were some, in that regard, but not in the sense where I think people were nitpicking his work really at the time. Other professional historians, I think he was fairly well regarded in his day.
How did they get the?
Oh.
How did they get the word out that this book? Was it just in libraries? Like now you have book signings at bookstore and media.
Mm-hmm. Like Quaife's book there would be publication lists. There were literary societies. There were any range of essentially paper distribution catalogs that were put out. I guess there are versions of media blasts, articles in newspapers. Not as again, it's more basic in terms of what we think of today. I'm not entirely sure, but when you look at the answer to that, but when you look at even Quaife and what he's producing, for when he's at the Detroit Public Library, he's putting together and scouring lists of stuff that's published, and then he's disseminating that knowledge in bulletins to memberships of the organization. When he was at the Wisconsin Historical Society, both Quaife and his predecessors were putting out bulletins that were not only interesting historical facts, but also new publications that are out there. So kind of like, say, through newsletters and all of the above. So there was this more analog approach to distributing knowledge, but there was a means to doing that. That's the best answer I can give you,
Yes.
but I think that's pretty close to how it. Yes, ma'am.
I was just wondering, do you know if he ever came to view the Indian agency?
I do not know that. That actually is an interesting. It's it would make sense, and it's quite possible his papers do exist. So, and I think is it at Detroit? It would make sense that his papers would be at Burton. And I've seen reference to his papers, and it's escaping me at the moment as to where. But in there, I'm sure if there's evidence of that, it would be in there. But considering the fact that if he's traveling up to Sault Ste. Marie on historic research, I mean, he's living in Chicago. I mean, Chicago today is only a, well, yeah, yes, he was living in Matt. You're right. So I mean, and train ride up. It's a short train ride up to Portage. That at the very now, granted, at the time that he's writing, I mean, this was all private property. But did he come out to Fort Winnebago? My guess is
1918, he was at the Historical Society already, right?
he was, yeah, and
That year, the Historical Society sponsored a
pilgrimage.
excursion out to the agency house in Fort Winnebago. So,
It would be impossible to imagine that he was not there. And so maybe I think the answer is yes. Yes, he did, which again would be very fitting. I don't know why, for me, I would not come in. Yeah. No, indeed, that's an interesting question, because like I say, as a historian, it's one of the things about when you're really studying something, you should always go to the site of what you're writing about, even if it's radically changed. There's something about that when you're actually researching and writing something that does give you a connection to what you're, and so I think it'd be almost impossible to imagine that he didn't come out here at least once. It's a good question. Yes, ma'am.
It sounds like there are a lot of internal politics between he and the three ladies of the Wisconsin Historical Society. Did they, I assume there was another director that came in after him.
Yes. Yes, the superintendent that followed him was Joseph Schaefer. And Schaefer, to my understanding, had equally, I don't want to say that their careers were checkered at the agency, but they had difficulties. And the State Historical, there's actually a really good book put out by the Wisconsin Historical Society on its own history that actually goes into some detail in Quaife's time there, and also talks about Schaefer. And the Schaefer was very interested in publishing. He was trying to create something known as the Wisconsin Doomsday book, which was a documentation of Wisconsin then, like in the 1920s, as well as then collecting historical material to essentially create this vivid, almost minuscule picture of what is and what was Wisconsin historically, and then at the time contemporary. One of the great books that were published through this project, one of the only books, I think there are only 2 books that were published as a result of this project. One is called The Wisconsin Lead Region, and is a very good encapsulation of the whole lead mines, to the southwest of us. That was produced by and written by Schaefer. And here I'm going to be speaking off my stump here a little bit and getting maybe a little bit off my expertise. But I think it was the project, given that it was the agency was still struggling as a result of World War I. You also had, I was looking back there, is that those three gals, even though they didn't like, or maybe not to say they didn't like Quaife, but disagreed with him, they were also the main mover and shakers that kept the society moving during these time periods. So someone like Annie Nuns, I mean, the fact that, before Quaife and during Quaife and even after Quaife was a driving force behind the agency and keeping it going through World War I, it says a lot about who she was and her capabilities. She passes away under, I believe it is, Schaefer's tenure, as does those other gals, there's like a leadership turnover, there's a staffing turnover there, simply aging out, I think, under that. So Schaefer is struggling with that. He's struggling with budgets and tightening of budgets. And he has these huge projects, these huge publishing projects that are never really materialized because there's simply, the agency's unable to support them at this point. And he doesn't stay as long as Draper or Thwaites. I forget when Schaefer leaves. And I also forget who comes after him, but there is almost a renaissance, I would consider, for the Wisconsin Historical Society in the late 40s when you have Clifford Lord arrive. And he is a young, dynamic, energetic director. And it's under Clifford Lord that you have in the 1950s kind of a rebirth of the organization and the expansion of the organization around the state. I think, encapsulating that idea, the Wisconsin idea of the boundaries of the university or the boundaries of the state. Well, the boundaries of the WHS are the boundaries of the state, because he's also, I mean, I don't know if that's exactly what he encompassed, but it's certainly reflective in that that's when you have the historic sites forming. Wade House up in by Fond du Lac, between Greenbush, essentially up in that area. Villa Louis, Cassville, Stonefield of Cassville, Circus World Museum are all significant state sites that come into play in the 1950s under the tenure of Clifford Lord. So, I mean, like all organizations, you have, you know, very effective leaders, but you have some leaders that are struggling with their time periods and some that are more effective than others. I think Schaefer was effective, but maybe not as effective as Quaife. I think Quaife was effective, but times were working against him. You know, and the fact that he was following a popular director with a staff that was loyal to that popular director. You know, that's life. I mean, that's the reality of that. Happens everywhere. But yeah, Schaefer follows. That's a long answer to say that Schaefer followed Quaife. So, are there any other?
Interesting side note is Susanne Nuns was the granddaughter of the man who built Juliet Cruise's piano.
I did not know that.
Yep. So when they were restoring this house, there was correspondence with her to figure out what type of piano to get to represent the type Juliet has. So.
It's all connected, isn't it? There's always these connections with history, even when you don't expect it. That's cool. Well, thank you all very much.